Then you have Stereolab, who are kind of middle-class Marxists who all went to art school, who reference Steve Reich and experimental film. It does kind of make sense why, like, fans of Oasis, for example, might look at Stereolab and think, who the fuck are these?
It's a massive U-turn in the record as a whole, I think, because you're kind of drifting along quite nicely with all this lounge music, and then suddenly you kind of go, whoa, what the fuck is this? Like,
yeah, this is like a Goldie track in the middle of this record. Yeah.
And basically, they just stuck them in a shopping trolley and walked around London, going to different record stores and just selling them, like they were selling strawberries or whatever.
Welcome back to Death with the Record. This week we're going to be looking at Stereolab's 1997 album Dots and Loops. Now, I imagine some of you watching or listening to this episode will have an intimate knowledge of Stereolab's music, but for those of you who don't, here is a very brief rundown of who Stereolab are. So Stereolab are a part English, part French, part Australian band fronted by the now ex-couple Tim Gain and Laetitia Stadier. And just for your information, that will not be the first time that either me or Ollie mispronounces something in French over the course of this episode. But Gain and Stadier actually met in Paris in 1988 at a gig of Tim Gain's old band, McCarthy, after which they quickly began a relationship and then their own band too, Stereolab. So we'll be going into more detail about their relationship later on. Hint to everyone out there thinking of starting a project with their significant other. Don't do it. It does not end well. We'll also be going to talk a bit about Stereolab's music and how you might kind of go about defining that or even describing it. But first, as always, we start with the year in music on this podcast. The year was 1997. Ollie, an unbelievable year, no?
Yeah, man, there was quite a few really, really top releases in 97. I think we could probably spend a good 10 minutes poring over the array of top records that came out. But I think you and I both just want to crack on with Stereolab, really. So what I'm going to do instead is whiz through the best stuff that came out across three genres, and I'll try and do it in under a minute. And then you are going to judge in a completely reductive and useless manner which genre won 1997. So it's basically like Death with the Record meets Countdown.
Okay, well, if I get my kind of timer out on my phone, I'll
get your stopwatch out.
Right, stopwatch is out. Ready? 3, 2, 1, go.
Hip hop. You got Missy Elliott bringing out the debut. Biggie, posthumous Life After Death came out. Wu-Tang brought out a second album. Jay-Z, In My Lifetime. Slum Village debut. Erykah Badu debut. Hip hop done. Electronic. Daft Punk brought out Homework. Ronnie Size and Represent won the Mercury Prize for New Forms. Prodigy, Fat of the Land. Chemical Brothers, Dig Your Own Hole. Aphex Twin, Come to Daddy. Oteka, Chiastic Slide. Electronic. Bosh. Rock and alternative. Radiohead, OK Computer, Spiritualized, Ladies and Gentlemen, We're Floating in Space. Blur brought out an album. Buena Vista Social Club brought out a debut. Sleater Kinney, Pavement, Bjork, Homogenic, Portishead, Yola Tango, and Nick Cave as well. Nick Cave was the final one.
Jeez, fair enough. You did it within the time. That was impressive, man. That was impressive.
So now, in the spirit of brevity, you've got 10 seconds to tell me which genre won and why.
Oh, Jesus Christ. I'm just going to go with rock and alternative. Sure.
Oh, I thought you might say that, mate.
Well, okay. I know you'd probably go with electronic, and I'm going to go with rock and alternative, and that probably represents quite nicely our relative biases, doesn't it? So.
Okay, so how about another question? So in Series 2 of Death with the Record, which is soon to be sponsored by Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube or something, you can choose just one of the records that I've mentioned there to do an episode on. Which is it going to be? And if you say OK Computer, then we're going to have to stop recording right now.
The thing is, I was about to say OK Computer. I won't go with OK Computer. I'll go with Spiritualized. Ladies and Gentlemen, We're Floating in Space. That would be the one I'd pick. In fact, you may even see that in the second series, but it will be a while before we do OK Computer, just because every time I suggest it, I guarantee that Ollie will respond with a roll of his eyes and a firm and quick fuck off. That's Year in Music. That's 1997. I think we did a good job of making that fairly brief, considering how big a year it was. But let's get onto the album. Let's go on to Stereolab and Dots and Loops. It's almost hard to know where to start with Stereolab, because this is a band that can sometimes seem a bit obsessed with referencing as many bits of music or culture in their songs as possible. It's a band whose lyrics usually allude to some kind of ideology or philosophy, whether that's Marxism or situationism or modernism or postmodernism or surrealism. Some of the musical genres people have tried to define them by include krautrock, lounge music, lo-fi, avant-pop, art pop, kitsch pop, post-rock, retro, futurist, dream pop.
Keep going,
I could
lad.
go on for a while. I won't. You'll be glad to hear. The band, of course, as I've mentioned, is fronted by Tim Gain and Laetitia Sadier, the former of which has described his musical philosophy as to be unique is more important than to be good. So, to those in the audience who haven't really listened to Stereolab before, please do not turn off this podcast already. I don't want to give the impression that this band is absolutely entirely stuck up in the clouds or up their own arses. But, that said, clearly there are some contradictions at hand here. So my opening question to you, Big Ol, is this. Is it possible to describe this band, Stereolab, succinctly without tending towards the kind of thing that forms the content of pitchfork journalists' erotic dreams, as I just read out there? So if so, please can you do that for me?
Yeah, it's a good question because, as you say, reading articles, reviews about Stereolab, it can sometimes feel like a kind of literary competition among journalists to name drop as many genres and artists and movements as possible. And
100%.
it is quite draining and tedious sometimes. So I've gone the other way. As you say, I've tried to be concise. So this is what I've gone for. Stereolab can be loud or soft, sometimes French, sometimes English, but always unique. What do you think about that, Jamie?
Wow, man. I actually quite like that. Can you read out for me one more time?
So, can be loud or soft, sometimes French, sometimes English, but always unique. So I'm trying to get at the bilingual singing of Laetitia Sadier.
Yeah.
They're capable of like loud rock songs, but then also softer, delicate moments as well. But do you want to know why I think you like what I've just said there, lad?
Go on. What have I backed myself into a corner here? Why
So
do I like that?
The reason you like that is because it actually follows 5/7/5 form. So that's a haiku.
Oh, it's a haiku. It's a haiku. Oh,
and
I see what you're trying to say.
you fancy yourself as Stanford's poet laureate, but I am the Bard of Stockport, mate. So you need to remember your place.
The Bard of Stockport.
There is only
Jesus
one
Christ.
wordsmith, one carver of language on this podcast, and it is definitely me.
Very good. I like that, though. You'll have to try and get that published in some journals.
But as a little introduction to the app, I've got quite a fun game planned actually. So thinking about the way that this band are described in the press, I thought it could be quite funny if I read you a list of quotations and you've got to tell me whether you think that I've written them or whether these are actual things that I've managed to find on music publications on the internet. So I thought this could be quite good just to demonstrate the point we're making.
Yeah, please go on. I'm interested.
Right, okay. So the first one, Stereolab, Dots and Loops, track number 3. The best fellatio music there is. Get that song on repeat.
I mean, that's got to be you, hasn't it?
No, mate. No, that is not me. Do you want to know which high-profile producer came up with that quote? It was Pharrell Williams.
Oh, surely not.
From NERD. Yeah.
So Pharrell is getting head to Stereolab.
To the flower called Nowhere. There's quite I don't want to say graphic, but there's a video. There's quite an intense video on YouTube, let's say, of him talking about this song in quite an energetic way.
I haven't hooked this up yet, but I'm gonna play Stereolab in the bathroom with the girl. Play number 3 on the album called Dots and Loops. Put it on repeat and play this with the girl in the shower, and it's gonna get crazy. Yeah! Stereolab, man. The best fellatio music there is.
So yeah,
wow.
Sorry, you got no points so far. The second one, I think Cobra and Phases is still my favourite Stereolab record. Some of the sounds on that album are fucking crazy. They defy description, just kind of weird pootling noises. Pootle, thwack pop. They should make a new genre called Pootle pop and put Cobra and Phases in it. What do you reckon?
I mean, this is really hard. You've done a good job. If this is you, then you've done a Pootle pop. I swear I've read that. I reckon that's like Pitchfork or someone.
See, that was one of Big Ol's. I've slipped it in there.
Oh my! This is going terribly.
Not out of 2. Right, next one. Whenever a new Stereolab record comes out, I wonder whether it'll sound like the later off-kilter twee era Stereolab or the band's earlier krautrockish 2-chord sound. Judging from the first single, it follows the later off-kilter jazz pop disco sound rather than their earlier model.
I mean, I want to say that this is written by someone again, but then isn't that the kind of the Better's fallacy when you think you've been wrong twice, you can't be wrong 3 times in a row? I mean, I'm going to say that's got to be a magazine, some kind of internet publication or something.
Wired. So
that was Wired. Okay, well, at least I feel a bit
better. You got
better.
1 point.
Yeah.
The guide to getting into Stereolab's high concept pop. So you want to get into Jazzy Exotica Stereolab, Political Stereolab, Krautrockin Stereolab, 60s Throwback Stereolab, other Stereolab related projects.
I mean, I don't know, you.
Wired again, mate. Wired again.
Wired again.
Let's see if you can rescue it with this last one.
Oh,
Emperor Tomato Ketchup documents a pre-millennial moment in which people, Jazzbos in Chicago and Red Mods doing the mashed potato in Washington, D.C., Riot Girls in the Northwest, Bass Cadets in Sheffield, and the Chic Set in Paris, and the Retro Futurists in Birmingham, and especially Crate Diggers in Tokyo, London and New York, wondered if record collecting and community organising might be the same thing.
Well, that's 100% you, because like Sheffield and Birmingham, what have they got
to
do with?
No, lad, no, it's Pitchfork.
No! How have I got that wrong?
Jamie,
how has
mate,
someone written that?
I know,
that?
It's a good example of the kind of tosser way that this band has spoken about. Hopefully we'll try and not engage in any of that over the course of the episode.
Jesus, I mean, I almost don't know what to say. What a terrible performance from me. Anyway, because seeing as we've now very looked at how the music press has attempted to describe Stereolab over the years, it's also worth noting that they've kind of derided them quite a lot as well. Most famously, there was an NME review of Cobra and Phase's Greek Play Voltage in the Milky Night. Yes, that is the name of that album. And this NME review opened with this sentence, Ollie. Well, you have to admit they're good at what they do, but then so was Hitler. So, I mean, they're basically getting compared to Hitler in a music group, which is pretty big. The NME review goes on. I won't read too much of it because it is horrific to hear, but they describe Stereolab's music as sexless, emotionless, cripplingly self-indulgent, self-satisfied, hollow, achingly pretentious, a sterile heap of shit. And basically about 3,000 words of that. Now, obviously, me and you, Ollie, love Stereolab, but I can kind of understand why some people might criticise them for what they see as the emotionlessness of their music. That it's maybe a bit robotic, a bit sanitized. If it was a colour, maybe it would be beige, if you know what I mean by that. And then they do, in interviews and in their music, have this kind of art school, Central St. Martin's kind of vibe that I can understand might piss some people off. Do you think that's fair?
I don't know, man. I mean, as you say, you and I are big fans of the group, so perhaps, I mean, I am definitely not the best person to be speaking about the flaws or the criticism that surrounds this band, but I think the idea that they're bland or boring or a cheap imitation of something else is absolutely absurd to me, because number one, who are they supposed to be imitating, and who are they supposed to be imitating badly? I can't think of any other groups which sound like them, and I think they're responsible for some of the most creative and inventive rock and pop music that I've ever heard. Where I can understand frustrations is maybe with some of the more niche, esoteric references they make in their music to political movements or art genres or philosophies, because those types of references can be seen as pretentious and rub people up the wrong way, and that then becomes a stick to beat them with, and from there spawns all the chat about them being beige and bland. So I can kind of understand some of it, but from a musical point of view, I've never really understood that criticism, to be honest.
Yeah, I think you've launched a good defence there. The only thing I would say that's you need to consider is the context of when they were releasing this music and where, that being the UK. Obviously, this is the time where Britpop was at its most popular. And considering that Britpop is more or less about back to basics aesthetics, it's very conscious of class difference. It's simple songs like the Beatles, like true English music, quote unquote. Then you have Stereolab, who are kind of middle class Marxists who all went to art school, who reference Steve Reich and experimental film. It does kind of make sense why, like, fans of Oasis, for example, might look at Stereolab and think, "Who the fuck are these?" That. I think, as you say, me and you are big fans of the group, so we're certainly not of that opinion. Anyway, to move on to the album itself, Dots and Loops. One thing that's interesting about this album is that it's very different from some of Stereolab's earlier work. And the reason that is it was the first record of theirs to be recorded on Pro Tools. So for those of you who don't know what that means, basically it means that this album was recorded digitally with the use of computers rather than to tape or in analog. So what this meant is that it was a lot easier to record overdubs, to loop layers upon layers, to add hundreds of little tiny details and embellishments in a way that they weren't really able to do earlier on in their career. Stereolab, this is. It does, as a result, have a slightly excessive style, at least, and certainly a ridiculous amount of detail to it. You can definitely hear that change in the sound, right, Ollie?
Yeah, I'm 100%. I think the lounge music aspect is definitely what's noticeable to me. So all the horns, all the guitars, all the piano parts sound really lush, really fresh, really harmonious. And as you say, there's basically just a sheen on dots and loops that just isn't on previous work. I think the other thing is, musically, I'm not saying that they weren't creative before this point, but I think dots and loops definitely widen the scope considerably of the kind of sounds that they were using. So they're still playing around with synths, but there's massive horn sections on this album. There's big string moments. Yeah, like all manner of percussion, and just as you say, because it's been recorded on Pro Loops, you can add in all these strange noises. There's just a lot of weird sounds giving rise to the tag of elevator music that I always read. I think maybe the best way to describe this album, or at least the way I think it is, it doesn't really sound like it was made on Earth. I feel like it sounds like it belongs on like a moon of Jupiter, compared to earlier stuff.
Which is why that tagline, as annoying as it is, the retro futurist dream pop.
Yeah,
it does have a.
It does kind of get at it. Yeah, annoyingly.
It does. I mean, that said, like a lot of fans of Stereolab at the time were absolutely aghast and horrified by this change. Because if you listen to their earlier records, I mean, listen to Peng, which is their first album, and you listen to this, the difference is like astronomical. Not to make another space pun, and even oh my god, I can't believe it. That's getting edited out in the post production. If not, there you go. Anyway, in hindsight, Tim Gaines said of this album that he thought it maybe suffered from a bit too much of that looping or artificial playing or that kind of surface sheen, and they ended up going back to analog recording methods in the future. So that's something to consider. But anyway, should we start talking about some of the tracks, Ollie, and some of the standout moments on this Sick record?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me the best song is the opening song, Brakhage, and I always feel a little bit sad when my favourite song on an album is the first song. I don't know if you feel like that, because it's sort of like you kind of set up and then the rest of it is a relative disappointment, but oh well. I really, really like the opening minute, and I think the way the guitar kind of comes shimmering in after all the interplanetary strange noises is just a really, really beautiful opening to the album, I think.
Yeah, the synths on this album, but especially that first song, they have this really weird quality to them where it almost sounds like they're kind of like decaying sound, or like the Geiger counter kind of like buzzing to it. And that song and that intro to the album, the first 30 seconds, is such a perfect example of that. The other thing on Brakhage that I would kind of want to draw attention to is the melody in the lyrics. The melody particularly has this weird kind of nursery rhyme sense to it. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, because there's obviously Laetitia Sadier, who's the main singer, but then there's Mary Hansen as well, who's kind of like a backing vocalist, and I think the interplay between the two of them is really important in the song. Mary's acting as this kind of high-pitched mirror, and it works wonderfully, I think.
Yeah, it does for sure.
One of my favourite things about that song actually is just how simple the words are. I think Sadier is at her best as a lyricist when she's kind of using succinct, simple language. I've read an interview that she was a big fan of the Smiths growing up, and specifically Morrissey, because apparently he reminded her that there was always someone more miserable than she was, which is kind of enlightening.
That's good. I like that.
But sometimes when you listen to the Smiths and Morrissey's just trying to be too clever for his own good, and sometimes you think
that's a lot of the time, isn't it?
Yeah, and if you're just when he's simple with his language, his point always seems so much truer and so much finer. I think she suffers from the same kind of thing usually. But on Brakhage, I think the opening chorus is, we need so many damn things to keep our days' lives going. Many things to keep our lives going. So many things. Like that in a nutshell says so much without really using, complex political words like, autocratic dystopian despotism is doomed and stuff. It's like, okay, like I get it. I get what you're trying to say. Yeah,
you're absolutely right, because that the Marxist message that is pretty consistent throughout all or the anti-consumerist message is so perfectly distilled, and we need so damn many things to keep our days' lives going, as opposed to just the listing off of all these movements. So yeah, I couldn't agree more.
What are your favourite tracks?
I think one that jumps out to me is a song like no other. I've never heard anything like this and still haven't to this day, and that's Parsec. So one thing that's really, really interesting about this song is that it was used recently, or in the early 2000s, for the launch of the new Volkswagen Beetle. So obviously the Volkswagen Beetle is kind of synonymous with the hippie movement of the 60s and flower power. And the tagline for this advert was "Less flower, more power." And I think it's so interesting that the advert, or the marketing department for Volkswagen, literally seemed to position Stereolab as this bridge between the future and then the past, or the 1960s in this case. I think it's like a really good metaphor for the album as well, because this album, in a way, it is half 60s flowery pop, and the other half is this really futurized, motorized, kind of space-infused thing that we've already talked about. So I can't really remember a time that I've heard a song and an advert and been like, wow, that is so perfectly conveying what they what they're trying to get at with this product. The other thing about that song as well is that we talk about Pro Tools and the techniques and that that they were using on this album, what the kind of new things that afforded them. When you listen to this track and that jungle influenced kind of breakbeat drum track, that is a perfect example of when Pro Tools is giving them allowing them to do things that they just simply wouldn't have been able to do if they were recording straight to analog.
It's a massive U-turn in the record as a whole, I think, because you're kind of drifting along quite nicely with all this lounge music, and then suddenly you kind of go, whoa, what the fuck is this? Like,
yeah, this is like a Goldie track in the middle of this record. Yeah.
I reckon you could get away with dropping that at the right moment in a club or at a party. I think it would kind of fucking shock people a little bit. Yeah, but there's something about it that just makes you want to move, and as you say, it's basically like a kind of their take on a drum and bass track, really.
Yeah, I mean, if someone, as you say, it has to be at the right moment. But if that did get dropped at the right moment, and I was there, it would be the kind of thing that like you remember that moment for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
You want to talk about like dance floor moments that you will change your opinion of things. That would be one. If someone could successfully pull that off, I would love it beyond belief.
Well, I reckon it'd be an absolute nightmare to mix, because it's in 5/4 time signature, isn't it? Like,
yeah. I didn't even think about that aspect.
That's probably beyond big old B2B Lil J level. You'd probably have to be a professional DJ.
I was going to say, if someone's going to do it, it's probably not going to be us, but let this be a challenge to all the actually decent DJs out there. If you can mix in from the actual vinyl this track, then have a beer on Death of the Record. In forms of other songs that I just wanted to bring up as well, I have to talk about Miss Modular, which I think is kind of like a nice glittering centerpiece to the album. It has those really 60s kind of doo-wop vocals in the background, which Mary Hampson, that we've mentioned, sings, and then the really sensual French lyrics. So that for me is a very classic Stereolab sounding song. And if I wanted to say to someone, here's an album, or here's a song to get into Stereolab, here's a song that will allow you to get into this album, I would probably show them Miss Modular.
I think Rainbow Conversation as well, actually. Probably I always kind of link the two of those just in terms of the joyousness, I think.
Yeah, definitely. All that said, we've been very positive, almost unusually so for Death with the Record at this point of the podcast. Are there any tracks that you're less keen on?
So one thing I should probably say, maybe for people that aren't familiar with Stereolab, usually on each album they release, they have at least one song that's over 15 minutes long. It seems like, they're about to put the album out and then suddenly they go, okay, we haven't got a long song, we need to get one on there.
Yeah, there's like a quota almost.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tradition. And the track on Dots and Loops, I think it's like 17 minutes long. It's called Refractions in the Plastic Pulse. And I don't have a problem at all with longer songs or movements within an album, but there has to be some kind of flow, and this track just doesn't have that. There isn't really any sense of cohesion at all. To me, it feels like they've just gone, okay, we've got 3 or 4 4-minute long songs. Let's just jam them together, stitch them together, because we haven't got a long one. And it doesn't, I don't know, to me, that's track, it kind of sticks out. It doesn't really make much sense.
Yeah, I honestly, I think I agree with you, especially considering that this quota that they fulfill with other albums has produced some of my favourite Stereolab tracks like Blue Milk or Jenny Under Your Line. Like, those are amazing songs that are over 15 minutes long. Whereas I feel like Refractions in the Plastic Pulse represents basically all the criticism that Stereolab have faced. It's a bit overwrought, too much going on. It's a bit hard to pass sometimes.
It did.
So I would agree with that.
It did kind of get me thinking, as a maybe slightly humorous way to end the album chat. What is the best example of a song that you've heard that is just stupidly or unnecessarily too long? Is there one that's jumping off the top of your head?
I mean, in terms of unnecessarily long, I would say that Sun Kill Moon is the king of that. Like on his last album, 5 of the 7 songs were longer than 12 minutes. And one of them was 23 minutes long. And it's not like he's even making like post-rock songs. It's just him speaking with an acoustic guitar the whole time. So, I mean, he's recently been cancelled, and deservedly so. So Sun Kill Moon would be the example I can think of. But I guess it's more annoying, and what you're getting at is when there's a pop song which should be 3 minutes or could quite easily be 3 minutes long. And then they insist on trying to make it like 8 or 9 minutes with some stupid outro that just is not necessary.
Well, 8 or 9 would be quite short by the example that I've got lined up. So I know you don't like Oasis, so I thought I'd
here we go again.
see if I could find their longest song. So in 2002, they released a track called, an album called Heathen Chemistry. I'm sure you've never ever listened to it.
Nope, never given it time of day, never intend on it.
The final track on the album is called Better Man. I want you to guess how long that song is.
I mean, it's not over half an hour, is it?
It's over half an hour. It's 38 minutes long. And I'd say about 30 minutes, maybe more of that is silence. Why? Why do people do this?
What's the point of that?
I don't understand.
What's the point of that? Do you think like Noel and Liam had a conversation and they were trying to make some kind of point about that? Because why have 30 minutes of silence? And you really pissed me off, Ol. If that was what you were trying to do with this, bringing up that, then that has annoyed me.
We better move on to Apex then, quick.
God, I don't get that. Right, let's move on to Apex. It seems like every time we go into Apex recently on this podcast, it's just me being really, really riled up. Anyway, Apex. This is the segment which requires us to pretend for a second that Stereolab's career is laid out before us like a landscape. All the peaks and troughs are there for us to see. Then we work out, where does this album fall? Is it at the peak of Mount Everest, or is it more likely to be swamped by rising sea levels in the next few years? In other words, is this Stereolab's best album? Is Dots and Loops their most important album, or even maybe their most popular? So, first of all, for this segment, Ollie, I wanted to point out just how hard it is to answer this question with Stereolab. And there is a reason for that. And that reason is that their discography is just absolutely vast. To give you an example of exactly what I mean, the entire discography of Stereolab comprises, are you ready, Ol?
Go for it, lad.
13 studio albums, 7 compilation albums, 15 EPs, 16 singles, and 23 rarities compilations. That's 74 releases in total. So, to add to this pain, most of their albums have been reissued with expanded versions. So on Spotify, if you wanted to kind of try and get into Stereolab, which hopefully this podcast might let you do,
isn't it?
Yeah, it's an absolute nightmare. There's so much music, so many compilations, all these singles and B-sides, and these albums aren't with their original dates. So it's so hard to make your way through it. But what do you think that reflects about Stereolab's way of making music, you think?
I think one thing that I'd say is, especially early on in their career, they were definitely quite a DIY indie band. If you think about what the word indie actually means, it means independent, separate from like a major label. And basically, when they started the band, Tim Gain wanted creative freedom and said, fuck it, we're going to launch our own label, and they called it Duophonic. They self-financed their first release, Super 45, and I think they had like 1,000 copies pressed. And basically, they just stuck them in a shopping trolley and walked around London, going to different record stores and just selling them, like they were selling strawberries or whatever. And even like after they'd had...
So it's a bit like when you come out of Camden Station and there's some bloke like outside just trying to flog his CDs.
Sorry, CDs. Like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, mate, I'm an MC, it's only £1. Yeah, it's crazy.
But then, even when they had a few releases under their belt, they'd continue painting, gluing all the vinyl records together, which I guess there's quite an interesting quote from Tim about that. Basically, after In Rainbows was released by Radiohead, I think he was asked by a journalist, like, would you ever consider doing something like Radiohead of doing and like releasing music for free on the internet? And he kind of said, well, it would have to be a little bit more interesting for me to wholeheartedly get into that. Because if you've been, like painting, gluing, pressing the records yourselves and like handing them out, I think uploading a bunch of MP3s to the internet would probably be a little bit dull by comparison.
It'd be heartbreaking, really, wasn't it?
Yeah. I think Stereolab are one of those groups where I've spent quite a decent chunk of my life listening to them, but I don't think I've even scratched the surface. I feel like you send me a song like every other week by them that I've never heard before, that I like even more than the last one that you've sent me.
Yeah, I mean, I do the same thing, just trying to get through all their rarities and all their little B-sides, because as you said, there's 23 rarity compilations, each with however many songs. You've got literally probably 1,000 Stereolab songs out there to release one way or another to get through, so there's a lot of music.
Because I think in terms of frequency of output, they're quite similar to the Smiths, who recorded and released a shitload of music, but they were only
indie band as well.
Yeah, but they were only together for 5 years. Stereolab have been producing music for like nearly 4 times that amount of time. So there's obviously just way more music for fans to consume, which is obviously a good thing. But then the flip side of that is, if you hear about what the process was actually like in the studio, it sounds fairly remorseless. Apparently Tim Game would just come to Sadier with like a bucket of 50 tracks and just be like, write lyrics please, and sing them. And then when they were in the studio, they'd have 35 tracks, do 35 drums, 35 bass, 35 keyboards, and just churn them out like an absolute factory, basically. And I know that Sadier had a problem with that. This kind of the not pondering on anything was what upset her, I think.
Yeah, because it's certainly like quite an unsentimental way of making music, isn't it? You record it all, and then you release it, and then that's that, and you move on to the next thing. I can't imagine ever being able to do that without, as Sadier says, feeling, I want to ponder on this, I want to think about this thing I've just released. Anyway, to get back to the question at hand, it is Apex. What is Stereolab's best album? So as we mentioned earlier, Ollie, Dots and Loops basically jettisoned a lot of their trademark sounds, and it gives basically their whole discography in hindsight a rather dramatic sense of pre-Dots and Loops and post-Dots and Loops. So as a way of trying to help us to answer this Apex question, which is obviously quite difficult with Stereolab, if we take this moment, this album, to be the moment where the die is cast, the sound changes, from that krautrock lo-fi style to this futuristic lounge kind of style, do you prefer their post or their pre-Dots and Loops releases?
For me, if you're sending me to a desert island, I can only have one of the two. I'm going with the early albums, which isn't to say that I don't like the group from 97 onwards, because I really, really like Cobra Phases. That's a brilliant album. Dots and Loops is fantastic, and I like Soundust as well. For me, I actually like the fact that they've changed so much, but you can always tell that it's them. It just feels like on each album, they're exploring like different areas, different nooks and crannies of the Stereolab universe, if you like. And maybe this is wildly optimistic, but I genuinely think it would be difficult for someone not familiar with the group to not like at least bits of one album. I'm not saying that you'd like the whole discography or you'd want to like listen to numerous records, but there are at least a few songs that you'll be able to find that you'd enjoy. I agree, yeah. To answer your question, the way I think about their albums is if I was inviting someone round for dinner on a date,
Here we go.
This is extended analogy. You obviously want to make sure you got the mood right. So you've been slaving away in the kitchen, cooking. Maybe you bought a nice bottle of wine to look sophisticated. Maybe a cheeky candle, that kind of thing. Yep. I think in that environment, Dots and Loops, Cobra and Phases, Soundust, ideal music. They're going to cut the mustard. They're warm. They're a little bit different. This is strange. What's this?
Yeah.
If I'm cooking for myself and I'm in a mood where I want to just turn the music up dead loud, I'm probably going to go for something a little bit more abrasive and play Peng or Emperor Tomato Ketchup. That's where my brain's at with Stereolab.
I really like that analogy. Yeah, there's there's the date music Stereolab, and there's the kind of by
rocking
yourself
out Stereolab,
rocking out. Oh mate, put something dead loud on and just rock out. Right, I'm gonna force the issue here. Let's try and answer this question: which is their best album, and is it Dots and Loops? Can you get a definitive answer from you, Ollie, on what that best one is?
I'm going Emperor Tomato Ketchup. It's got the raw metallic beat from early albums, but they're really starting to experiment with synths. I think the interplay between Sadier and Mary is top notch. Combo of heavy, proggy tracks and cheerful pop songs. That's the best for me. What were you saying?
I'm going to make another really inappropriate analogy. I think if you were to make like a political spectrum of their albums, then Emperor Tomato Ketchup is like centre left, Dots and Loops is centre right. The middle ground being, those kind of two albums occupy that middle ground. if you prefer one or the other, I would not fault you either way. I would personally go with Dots and Loops, but I can see why Emperor Tomato Ketchup might get that vote from someone else. So those two for me are the top two.
We've gone analogy mad today, haven't we?
We have gone analogy mad. Right, let's move on to the next segment. This is alternate cut. So in this segment, we try and engage with the major criticisms that surround the artist and reflect a bit on how our enjoyment of the record might be impacted. So this week we're considering a very particular question, and that question is this: Can being in a musical group with your romantic partner ever be destined for anything other than professional and personal disaster? Or in other words, was being in Stereolab actually at all enjoyable? I have some quotes to kind of add some context to this question for you all. So Tim Gain had this to say about making the album Transient Random Noise Bursts. Making that record was pure hell. In the end, I hated it, and I've pretty much hated it ever since. About Emperor Tomato Ketchup, he said, it was a difficult time. A lot of bad feeling, a lot of relentless touring. Okay. And Laetitia Sadier had this to say. She said, being on tour with Stereolab was crushing and exhausting. There was a way of working that was industrial and mass-produced that drove me crazy. We weren't laughing much. She then went on to say, I found it very difficult. To be in a collab project with my boyfriend was traumatizing. Sometimes I felt I was an object rather than an active participant. It was not a nice feeling. We were young and insecure. It was fantastic, but not always fun. What do those quotes suggest to you, Ollie, about the band dynamics of Stereolab?
So I think, first of all, with any group that are going to be active for the best part of 2 decades, obviously there's going to be periods of time where you're not gelling as well, where you're not getting on. That isn't particularly controversial. But I think what Sadier is talking about goes beyond simple arguments like between bandmates, between friends. The idea of feeling objectified whilst in the group, that's something that's a lot more serious. And I think it needs to be remembered that she was the only woman in Stereolab for long stretches. And naturally, you know, you're a bit more exposed as a singer than hiding behind a guitar, as she kind of said about Tim. I think the band dynamics are also tied to some other important events that happened in the group. And I think it's another reason why Mary Hansen's tragic death in 2002, who was the lady that we were talking about earlier, was so tragic, because it isolated Sadier even further within the group, because she'd lost not only one of her best friends, but also the only other woman in the band is no longer there. It also links to the way that the band was spoken about, particularly in France. There's a lot of misogynistic, sexist reviews that I've read from the 90s where, you know, they're not... French journalists weren't even talking about Stereolab's music. They were just, you know, saying, quote, non-sexy Sadier, like can't sing, etc. So I think there's a lot of things that tie into why I can definitely understand why being in Stereolab probably was not joyous for Sadier a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should probably call it what it is, which is that it was, you know, the dynamics were sexist. And I mean, I don't want to speak about, you know, Gain being a control freak or anything like that, because ultimately his meticulousness represents the bits of Stereolab I like most, like that arrangements, the fussiness, all those layers. That's why I love Stereolab. But if you want to talk about why Stereolab were able to go on for as long as they did before they kind of broke up unofficially, it's because of Sadier's capacity for compromise, really. Yeah. And to use my kind of degree and maybe get a bit too critical theory about this whole, you can make quite a nice link between the way that Sadier was positioned in the band with how, you know, the worker is positioned in capitalism. Because if you think about Gain, literally controlled everything. You know, he controlled the means of production. He wrote all the songs. He wrote all the melodies. He did all the recording. So when he gave the songs to Laetitia Sadier, she couldn't sing her own melodies. She couldn't sing her own tunes. Literally, all she had control of was the lyrics. In a similar way, you know, when we're kind of trying to protest against, you know, governments or capitalism, whatever you want to say, the only thing you really have is your voice. Maybe you have to sing their tune or sing to their tune, but you can choose your words. Which is why I think it's so important that Laetitia Sadier chose the words she did and was so strident about, you know, Marxism or whatever with her lyrics. It's almost like, you know, we are Laetitia Sadiers in a world full of Tim Gaines, or that's sometimes how it feels, at least.
I feel like as a fervent, you know, anti-capitalist, I think she'd actually quite like that analogy, mate.
She would. I mean, I'll have to pass it on to her at some point. But yeah, like full credit has to go to her for like her part in the group. And obviously, you know, it's very easy to talk about the singular male genius behind a music group like Tim Gaine, but she contributed a lot to their sound, I think, ultimately. I think
you're right, because you're speaking how, you know, Gaine's meticulousness is one of the things that, you know, you find most attractive about the band. But I think for me, when I think of Stereolab, the first thing I think of is her voice. And there's definitely something to be said to that was her tiny little thing, and she made it one of the most important aspects of the entire group.
Absolutely, couldn't have put it better myself. To end this little segment of alternate cuts, I have a quote for you, Ollie, that might illustrate what we were talking about. So in 2019, when Stereolab reformed to do some touring, they were in an interview with a Guardian journalist, and the journalist asks, why are you touring again now? And Tim kind of mumbles back to the journalist saying, we're promoting the reissuing of our back catalogue. And Laetitia Sellier, very forthright, very clearly interrupts and says, no, it's for the money. Just like completely like that, it's for the money. And it kind of reminds me a bit of what Jack White said about the White Stripes. And if you ever see us touring again, it's for one reason and one reason only, and that's the money. So in answer to that original question of can being in a band with your partner be destined for anything other than complete acrimonious failure?
Maybe not.
The answer's probably not, yeah. Should we move on to album cover Nightclub?
Yeah, let's go for it. So as always, we're going to end Death with the Record by imagining a situation where the album cover that we're looking at is trying to get into a nightclub, and Jamie and I are the bouncers. This is the album cover Nightclub. But the artwork isn't being judged on, whether they've got a credible ID or whether they're suited and booted. Jamie and I are only looking at 4 things: aesthetics, originality, harmony between music and artwork, and whether or not this album cover has iconic status. As with any nightclub, there are 4 different ranks to the venue. First of all, go straight in, highest level Hall of Fame, no questions asked. VIP, not quite on GOAT level, but still a very commendable cover. Third is ticket on the door. 4, name's not down, you're not coming in, get out of sight. Absolutely embarrassing effort.
Yep.
So Jamie, before we cast our verdict on Dots and Loops and whether or not it's wasted its time getting all dressed up, there is one thing that I want to mention, and it concerns a little character known as Cliff. Are you hot or are you cold with what I'm on about?
I think I know what you're on about, but I certainly think that a lot of people might not know what you're on about. So please expand.
So Cliff isn't a session drummer that they've got in, or the producer or what have you. If you look at a lot of early Stereolab releases, there's a cartoon figure that adorns quite a few of the covers, and it's quite a simple sketch. It's just a figure with a kind of sadistic smile and basically like a pointed finger that is shaped in the barrel of a gun. And the band referred to this little quirky cartoon as Cliff. And it was actually a sketch which was taken from a 1970s underground Swiss newspaper, because
of course it was.
Yeah, this is Stereolab and they're that edgy. Yeah. But the group have basically taken inspiration from all sorts of places when it comes to the artwork, and they'll pinch things from like hi-fi magazines or classical musical sleeves, and Gain would basically find these little gems, maybe that's putting too fine a point on it, find these little things and basically pass them on to a couple of people he knew, and they'd make a version for the band, which usually involved getting quite a serious paint job because there's a lot of bright palettes on Stereolab covers. However, for Dots and Loops, similarly to the music and what we were talking about with Pro Tools, they followed a slightly different approach. Stereolab were impressed by some of the early artwork from a band called Broadcast, who were their kind of contemporaries. And the graphic designer who made Broadcast's album covers was a guy called Julian House. And he has actually worked with the band since Dots and Loops. And to be honest, I think quite a lot of the work that he's done has been fairly consistent. I'm interested to hear what you've got to say before I offer my opinion.
So, I mean, I think consistency is something you definitely got at. I would look at all of Stereolab's releases, and I would say that none of their album covers are, your name's not down, you're not coming in. I don't think they've ever made like a stonking kind of Love Movement-esque album cover, at least in my opinion. But I would say that maybe in favour of consistency, they've never really pushed the boat out that far. Yeah. And I don't look at any of them and kind of be absolutely head over my heels, although I do like quite a few of them. So I'd say maybe they're all kind of in on the door / VIP, and I would say, my verdict for Dots and Loops would be one of those two. What do you reckon?
So I really, really like Cobra and Phases. I think that would probably be VIP, but I think my favourite Stereolab cover is probably Peng, just because it has Cliff. He's kind of become, the cartoon figure that resembles the group, and I think he's fairly iconic. Maybe on like
he's their mascot. He's their mascot.
Big up Cliff. So that would probably be VIP. I think for Dots and Loops, it's in on the door.
It is. It's in on the door, isn't it?
It's fine. It's definitely not terrible. It's a cool piece of design, but it doesn't exactly blow your mind, I think.
Yeah, I would say that's fair. So we have another album cover in the club. They're in on the door, but making their way into the dance floor and having a good time. Right, at the end of this episode, as always, please get out at the socials, at Death with the Record on Instagram. We have content that goes up there consistently throughout the week, and you won't find that anywhere else. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. On Spotify and Apple Podcasts, please rate the podcast or follow. And as always, we'll see you next week. Ollie, can you play us out perhaps with that haiku about Stereolab again? Because I liked it just that much.
Let's go, man. Stereolab can be loud or soft, sometimes French, sometimes English, but always unique.